half of our symposium with 3 last lightning talks. The first is by Peter Zee from Cal State Northridge.
Hi, I'm happy to be here. I'm just going to talk about briefly some work I've been doing with Casey Terhorst, in collaboration with Casey Terhorst and Sebastian Schreiber at UC Davis. And
green button. It's the green button.
Sorry about that. So I'm interested in how the evolution of species interactions can contribute to shaping the structure and diversity of ecological communities. And so it's long been known that if 2 species have similar traits, that they might be able to partition and niche, and so they might, which could lead to divergence. But we also see in lots of communities that there's lots of species with very similar traits, suggests that there's some sort of ecological equivalence, and so this ecological equivalence has been thought to arise through potentially several different mechanisms, one just through simple speciation, but another through convergent evolution. And so a lot of this work, though, has been mostly looked at competitive interactions in structuring these communities, but we know that ecological communities, there's a broader ecological community context than this, and there's a diversity of interaction types that we see in nature. One in particular is that if you start to look at multiple trophic levels, so you can have, so in here you have a simple food web like this, where you have these blue consumer species that are competing for these green resource or basal species, but then these blue consumers can also eat each other, resulting in sort of omnivorous interactions. And so what we're going to ask quickly in this short talk is, how does incorporating this type of omnivorous interaction potentially affect the evolution of ecological equivalence in communities, or sort of looking at trait convergence. And so the way we've done this is using an individual-based simulation model, where we look at that same scenario I just talked about, but in this case we'll have 10 consumers and 10 basal species, which the trait values are randomly generated. And the key thing to note here is that in the consumers there's intraspecific trait variation, and that allows those species to evolve, while in the basal species we don't have those that trait variation, so those actually don't evolve. But they're all individuals have some phenotypic trait value, which is ecologically relevant because it determines the attack rate of the consumers on both the basal and the other consumer species. And I'd like to just point out that for all these species, there's an optimum trait value difference, which is the best for the consumer. There's some optimal difference, which is given by that theta there. And the way that we've modeled evolution in this is that in the consumers, there's random mating, and then the offspring are vary in how likely they are to be close in phenotype to the mid-parent value of those 2 parents. And so that's given by this sigma, and so when you have low sigma, you basically end up having kind of slower evolution. When you have high sigma, you have faster evolution. And so how do we quantify trait convergence? So we just did this very simple metric. So just want to note that for each sigma value that I'm going to talk about, we did 500 replicate simulations, and that of all the possible pairs of species that survived to the end of the simulation, we just looked at the difference in the trait values from the beginning of all those pairs compared to the end. So when you have a value of greater than 0, you diverge, and you have less than 0, you're converging. So quickly, I just want to show, so as you expect, when you have no omnivory, so there's the absence, just simply competition. As you expect, you get a lot of trait divergence there. But when you simply add in that convergence, you see that you get a lot of convergence, especially at these higher levels of sigma. And it's interesting to note that there's a it seems to be a threshold value of that sigma over which this convergence begins to happen. And so we're still working on trying to understand what the potential mechanisms of this are, but we can think that these 2 different types of ecological interactions provide very different, qualitatively different selection values. So if you think of this as like a niche overlap, on the left competition, for a pair of species, the competition will be strongest when they're most converged, but omnivory is going to be the strongest when they're slightly diverged at that optimum difference between ecological traits. So this is we're still working on, and be happy to talk about anybody about it afterward.